Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Louisiana. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing what places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the year 1842, when the cypress trees stood tall and the humid air carried whispers along the Mississippi River, there existed a plantation just outside New Orleans where events unfolded that few would believe and even fewer would speak of. The plantation was owned by the Turner family, whose wealth had grown from cotton and sugar cane, harvested by the hands of over 100 enslaved people. The estate, known as Willow Creek, stretched across 2,000 acres of fertile land, with a grand house positioned on a slight rise that allowed the master to survey his domain. According to parish records, the Turner family was well respected among the Southern aristocracy. Church attendance records show they occupied the front pew every Sunday, and local newspapers frequently mentioned their charitable donations. But as many historians would later note, such public displays of virtue often masked darker private realities. What happened at Willow Creek would remain buried for nearly a century before fragments began to surface. The first mention appears in a letter dated April 18, 1842, written by Reverend Samuel Whitmore to his brother in Boston. "I have encountered something most unsettling at the Turner plantation. A man they call Jacob, who they claim was taught nothing but fieldwork, demonstrated a knowledge of Latin that would shame most scholars at Harvard. Mr. Turner seemed most displeased by this revelation, though I cannot understand why one would not celebrate such remarkable aptitude." This letter, discovered during the renovation of an old church in Massachusetts in 1962, was the first thread that would eventually unravel a tapestry of secrecy. County records indicate that Jacob had been purchased by Howard Turner in 1839 from a plantation in Virginia. The bill of sale described him simply as male, age approximately 25 years, strong build, field worker. Nothing in the official documentation suggested extraordinary abilities or education. According to household ledgers preserved in the Louisiana State Archives, Jacob was initially assigned to the fields, but was later moved to work in the main house. A notation from October 1840 states, "Negro Jacob reassigned to house duties, demonstrates unusual literacy." This seemingly innocent entry marked the beginning of what would become a psychological battle of wills that would end in tragedy. It was during this time that the mistress of the house, Elizabeth Turner, began keeping a private journal. The leather-bound book, discovered hidden in a wall cavity during renovations in 1958, provides disturbing insights into the dynamics of the household. Her entry from December 12, 1840, reads, "Howard has taken an unusual interest in the new house servant. He spends evenings in his study with the man, though what transpires there he refuses to discuss. I hear voices, sometimes raised, sometimes hushed. The other servants avoid speaking of it. The journal entries become increasingly troubled over the following months. By February 1841, Elizabeth writes, "The atmosphere in the house has changed. Howard sleeps poorly and drinks more than is proper. He has ordered additional locks for the library door and keeps the key with him at all times. When I inquired about his studies with Jacob, he became irate and forbade me to mention the matter again." What exactly transpired between Howard Turner and Jacob remains largely speculative, but fragments of evidence suggest an extraordinary scenario that defied the strict social hierarchies of the antebellum South. A visiting merchant named Thomas Blackwood recorded in his business ledger a curious transaction in March 1841. "Sold to H. Turner, one Latin Bible, imported from Rome at significant premium. Customer most insistent on authenticity and age of text." The Bible referenced would later be identified as a 17th century Vulgate edition, an unusual possession for a plantation owner with no academic background in theology or classical languages. More curious still was a series of purchases that followed: Latin grammar texts, classical Roman histories, and various scholarly works that seemed at odds with Turner's known interests and education. According to testimony given decades later by Martha Johnson, who had been a young house servant at Willow Creek, the relationship between master and slave had begun conventionally enough. Mr. Howard, he noticed Jacob could read some English words which wasn't allowed, she recalled in an interview conducted in 1923 when she was in her 90s. But instead of punishment, he got this strange look, started testing him with different books. Then one day he brought out this old Bible with strange writing. We all expected Jacob to be whipped for his learning, but something else was happening. What emerged from Martha's recollections and corroborating documents suggests an arrangement as remarkable as it was dangerous. Howard Turner, who had received only a modest education despite his wealth, appeared to be using Jacob's unexpected linguistic abilities for his own purposes. But the nature of these purposes remained obscure until the discovery of Howard Turner's private correspondence with a Professor William Harrington at Princeton University in 1865. In these letters, written long after the events at Willow Creek, Turner made a startling admission. The man in my possession demonstrated an inexplicable facility with Latin text, though he claimed never to have been instructed. When presented with classical works, he translated with a fluency I found both useful and disturbing. I proposed a bargain, his knowledge for certain privileges. In my ambition to secure a position among scholarly circles, I passed his translations as my own. The arrangement suited us both, until it did not. This confession, made after the Civil War when such admissions carried fewer risks, casts a troubling light on what local newspapers had reported in 1843, that Howard Turner had published several acclaimed translations of obscure Latin texts, earning him brief recognition in academic circles. What the newspapers didn't report was the source of his sudden scholarly prowess. The plantation's account books show that during 1841 and 1842, Jacob received unusual allowances: better quarters, different food, and most remarkably, permission to use the library under supervision. These privileges, unprecedented for an enslaved person, came with conditions that would later be described by Elizabeth Turner as a pact with the devil himself. According to her later journal entries, Howard had promised Jacob his freedom in exchange for translating a specific set of Latin texts. Howard speaks of manumission papers being drawn up, she wrote in September 1841. I asked when our translator would leave us, and he laughed in a way that chilled me. When the work is complete, he said, and not before. I fear the work will never be deemed complete. The tension in the house evidently grew as months passed. Parish records show that the Turners attended church less frequently. Neighbors reported strange hours kept at the main house with lamps burning in the library until dawn. One visitor, Caroline Beaumont, wrote to her sister, "Elizabeth seems a changed woman, thin and nervous." She confided that Howard has become obsessed with some scholarly pursuit. The house feels oppressive with unspoken tensions. I was relieved to depart. The most disturbing account comes from a letter written by Dr. James Merrill, who was called to the plantation in April 1842 to treat Elizabeth for nervous exhaustion. In his private correspondence to a medical colleague, he noted, "The patient suffers from lack of sleep and persistent anxiety." She spoke feverishly about Latin texts and translations, claiming her husband had promised freedom to a slave in exchange for scholarly work, a notion too absurd to credit. More concerning was her insistence that the man in question spoke Latin as if born to it, and that her husband had become convinced there was something unnatural about such ability in a field hand. Dr. Merrill's letter continues with an observation that would prove prophetic. Mrs. Turner fears violence will erupt. The slave, she says, has completed translations of religious texts and historical works and now demands the freedom promised him. Mr. Turner, however, has become convinced that more can be extracted from this unusual arrangement and refuses to honor the agreement. I prescribed laudanum for Mrs. Turner's nerves, though I suspect what the household truly needs is a restoration of proper order. That proper order would never be restored. According to parish records, on the night of June 2nd, 1842, a fire broke out in the library of Willow Creek Plantation. The blaze was contained before it could spread to the main house, but the library and its contents were destroyed. Initial reports indicated an accident, perhaps a candle left burning, but subsequent investigations suggested more troubling possibilities. The New Orleans Picayune reported on June 5th that the scholarly collections of Mr. Howard Turner, including several rare volumes and manuscripts, were lost in the unfortunate conflagration. What the newspaper didn't report was that among the ashes, searchers found the remains of 2 men. The official report, filed by the parish sheriff and preserved in county archives, identified the deceased as Howard Turner and a male slave, identity uncertain. Later household inventories would confirm that Jacob was no longer among the plantation's enslaved population. The deaths were ruled accidental, a conclusion that satisfied local authorities and allowed the Turner family to maintain its standing in the community. But Elizabeth Turner's final journal entries tell a different story. In an entry dated June 1st, 1842, she wrote, "Howard has refused him again. I heard their voices from the library, Jacob speaking perfect Latin, quoting scripture that Howard couldn't understand without translation. He said, 'I translate this Bible for my freedom,' and Howard mocked him, saying no amount of translation would ever be enough. Jacob replied in Latin, something that made Howard grow pale. I fear what comes next." The entry from June 2nd, her last, reads only, "He knows too much. Howard says it cannot continue." The journal then falls silent, leaving the events of that night to speculation. In the aftermath, Elizabeth Turner sold the plantation and moved to Charleston, taking with her the surviving children and leaving behind the charred remains of the library. Willow Creek passed through several owners before being abandoned after the Civil War. The main house stood empty for decades, a silent witness to its dark history, before collapsing during a storm in 1912. The story might have remained buried had it not been for an archaeological dig conducted by Tulane University in 1957. Among the ruins of the library wing, researchers discovered a metal box that had survived the fire. Inside were fragments of parchment with Latin text and, most remarkably, translation notes in 2 distinct handwritings. Analysis confirmed that one was consistent with samples of Howard Turner's writing from other documents. The other remained unidentified. Professor Martin Cranwell, who led the excavation, noted in his findings, "The translations showed 2 minds at work, one struggling with basic Latin grammar, the other demonstrating extraordinary fluency and subtle understanding of nuance. What's most remarkable is that the more accomplished translator appears to have been correcting the work of the less skilled, turning conventional power dynamics on their head. The fragments included portions of religious texts, but also what appeared to be personal writing, a journal or letters written in Latin. One partially preserved segment, translated by Professor Cranwell, reads, "They believe what they see and see only what they believe. The master sees property where there stands a man. He cannot comprehend that knowledge exists beyond his permission. I wait, I translate, I bide my time. In these ancient words, I find my path to freedom, whether he honors his word or not." Martha Johnson's testimony, recorded 6 decades after the events, adds another layer to the mystery. According to her recollection, Jacob had claimed to have been raised from childhood by a Catholic priest in Virginia who had taught him to read and speak Latin. When the priest died, Jacob was sold to a plantation owner who had no use for his education. He kept it hidden, Martha said. Survival meant pretending ignorance. But Mr. Turner somehow discovered his knowledge and saw a way to use it. She also recalled whispers among the house staff about Jacob's ability. Some said he'd been a free man once, educated in Europe, before being kidnapped and sold into slavery. Others believed he had a gift from God. But Jacob told me once that knowledge was neither miracle nor magic, just something some men tried to keep from others. Perhaps most chilling was Martha's recollection of the night of the fire. Though she avoided direct accusation, her implication was clear. Mr. Howard and Jacob were alone in the library that night. There was shouting, first in English, then in that other language. We heard glass breaking. When the smoke began, Mistress Elizabeth ordered us not to sound the alarm until she gave word. She waited nearly 20 minutes before allowing us to call for help. In 1963, historian Dr. Eleanor Cartwright published an analysis of all available evidence in the Journal of Southern History, concluding, "The case of Jacob and Howard Turner represents a profound subversion of antebellum power structures through intellectual means. An enslaved man with extraordinary linguistic abilities used his knowledge as leverage against a system designed to deny his humanity." Whether Jacob survived the fire through Elizabeth Turner's complicity or perished alongside his master remains unknown. What is clear is that knowledge became a weapon in a battle that ultimately consumed them both. The final piece of this disturbing history emerged in 1966, when renovations to an old church in Natchez revealed a hidden compartment containing manumission papers prepared for Jacob, formerly the property of Howard Turner. The papers were dated May 25, 1842, but were never filed with county authorities. Alongside them was a small leather-bound book containing handwritten Latin phrases and their English translations. The flyleaf bore a single sentence: "Knowledge breaks chains that iron cannot." Whether Jacob died in the fire or somehow escaped remains one of Louisiana's enduring mysteries. Local folklore in St. Charles Parish includes stories of a free black man who appeared in the area after the Civil War, known for his ability to read ancient texts and his habit of quoting Latin proverbs. Some accounts claim he established a small school where he taught children of formerly enslaved people to read and write, though no official records confirm this. What is certain is that in the ashes of Willow Creek's library, something more than books was consumed. A system based on the denial of human potential confronted the undeniable evidence of intellectual equality, and in that confrontation, both master and slave were destroyed, one by his inability to recognize humanity beyond the boundaries of race, the other by his refusal to accept anything less than the freedom his mind had already claimed. The grounds where Willow Creek Plantation once stood are now part of an industrial complex. Nothing remains of the grand house or the library, where two men engaged in their fateful battle of wills and words. Occasionally, workers report finding fragments of charred books or melted glass, physical remnants of a fire that some say was an accident, others an act of rebellion, and still others divine judgment. In the parish records, the incident remains classified as an accidental fire that claimed 2 lives. The academic translations, published under Howard Turner's name, were largely forgotten, dismissed by later scholars as derivative and unremarkable. The true translator, whose perfect Latin so disturbed the established order, left behind only fragments, bits of parchment, scraps of translation, and the haunting question of what might have been had knowledge been valued above ownership. Today, visitors to the Louisiana State Museum can see the metal box recovered from Willow Creek and the fragments it contained, labeled simply as artifacts from antebellum scholarly activity. The full story remains largely untold in official histories, but in the oral traditions passed down through generations in St. Charles Parish, they still speak of the enslaved man who read in perfect Latin and brought a house of privilege crashing down with nothing more than words from ancient texts. Some say that on quiet nights, when the wind moves through the few remaining cypress trees that once bordered Willow Creek Plantation, you can hear what sounds like whispered Latin, the dead language that, for one man, became a pathway to either freedom or retribution. Those who claim to have heard it say the same phrase repeats, "Scientia potentia est," knowledge is power. In the end, perhaps that is the most disturbing aspect of this case. Not that an enslaved man possessed knowledge beyond what his captors thought possible, but that this knowledge threatened the very foundations upon which their world was built. In the antebellum South, the most dangerous revolutionary wasn't the one who wielded a weapon, but the one who turned the master's own language against him and demanded to be recognized not as property, but as a mind worthy of freedom. The Latin Bible that sparked this tragic chain of events has never been found. Some believe it burned in the fire. Others suggest Elizabeth Turner took it with her to Charleston. A few even claim it was buried with Jacob, wherever his final resting place might be. Like so much else in this story, it remains a mystery, wrapped in the silence of those who chose not to speak, and preserved only in fragments that historians continue to piece together, more than 150 years after flames consumed a library where an enslaved man read in perfect Latin, and a master realized too late that some forms of power cannot be owned. In 1959, during the cataloguing of Elizabeth Turner's possessions donated to the Charleston Historical Society, archivists discovered a series of letters she had written but never sent. Addressed to her sister in Philadelphia, these letters provide a disturbing glimpse into the final days before the fire. In one dated May 27, 1842, she wrote, "Howard has changed in ways that frighten me. He speaks of Jacob as both an asset and a threat. Yesterday, I overheard him say that a slave with such knowledge could inspire dangerous ideas in others. When I suggested he simply honor his promise of freedom, he looked at me as if I had proposed burning down the house." Another letter, dated June 1st, reads, "The tension has become unbearable. Jacob now refuses to translate further until the manumission papers are filed. Howard has taken to locking him in the library overnight to contemplate his situation. I hear them arguing in two languages, one I understand and one that sounds like the priest at Mass. Jacob's Latin flows more naturally than the father's. Howard grows more agitated with each demonstration of this ability. Last night he told me, 'No black man should speak the language of scholars and saints better than his master.' I fear what such pride may lead to." The most revealing letter, never completed, was dated June 2nd. "I can no longer stand by while Howard descends into this madness. This morning I saw the manumission papers in his desk, prepared but unsigned. When confronted, he admitted he never intended to file them. 'The man knows too much,' he said. 'Imagine if others learned what one of them is capable of.' Then he told me his plan to—" The letter ends abruptly there, the remainder either destroyed or never written. According to household accounts, Elizabeth Turner left Willow Creek with her children the morning after the fire. The plantation's overseer, James Wilkins, recorded in his log that she departed in a state of considerable distress, taking only essential belongings. No mention was made of books or papers among her hastily packed possessions. Records from the Bank of New Orleans show that on June 3, 1842, the day after the fire, Elizabeth Turner withdrew a substantial sum from the family account. The bank clerk noted that she appeared pale and resolute, and that she requested the funds in gold rather than banknotes. Where this money went remains unrecorded, though some historians have suggested it may have facilitated her rapid departure from Louisiana. In 1868, long after the Civil War had transformed the social landscape, a former Union soldier named Daniel Foster published a memoir of his experiences in Louisiana. In it, he described meeting an elderly black man in a small settlement near the Mississippi border in 1865. Among the formerly enslaved people trying to build new lives, I encountered a remarkable individual known locally as Professor. Though advanced in years and bearing severe burn scars on his hands and face, he operated a one-room school where he taught children to read and write. What struck me most was his extensive knowledge of classical languages. When I inquired about his past, he merely quoted Virgil in flawless Latin, then changed the subject. Foster's account continues. The local people spoke of him with a mixture of respect and unease. They said he had appeared in their community toward the end of the war, possessing nothing but a small leather pouch containing charred fragments of parchment and a gold coin dated 1842. Some claimed he had escaped from a plantation after some terrible event, though he never confirmed this. What was clear was that his education far exceeded what was typical even for free blacks before the war. This tantalizing reference has led some historians to speculate that Jacob may have survived the fire, possibly with Elizabeth Turner's assistance. The timing of her bank withdrawal, her hasty departure, and the appearance of a highly educated man with burn scars years later present a compelling, if circumstantial, case. However, without definitive evidence, this remains speculative. In 1960, historian Dr. William Carrington discovered an intriguing entry in the records of a small black church near the Mississippi-Louisiana border. The church's registry from 1870 lists a donation made by J.T. in gratitude for freedom obtained through knowledge. The donor is further described as a teacher of Latin and Greek, formerly of New Orleans. While the initials are suggestive, no conclusive link to Jacob has been established. Perhaps the most haunting piece of evidence emerged in 1965, when construction workers demolishing an old building in St. Francisville discovered a hidden room containing a makeshift desk, ink pots, and dozens of pages of Latin translations. Analysis dated the papers to approximately 1860, and handwriting experts noted similarities to the translation notes found at Willow Creek. Among the papers was a partial manuscript titled Memoirs of a Translated Man, written alternately in Latin and English. The fragmented manuscript begins, "I was born twice." First to parents whose faces I barely recall, who gave me life but could not give me freedom. Second to words on a page, ancient words in a dead language that awakened in me a self that could not be owned. My body remained in captivity, but my mind traveled to Rome, to ancient forums where men debated the nature of justice and liberty. In those pages, I discovered that the distance between slave and citizen is measured not in blood or color, but in the artificial boundaries men create to preserve their power. Later passages describe a relationship between a slave and master that closely parallels what is known about Jacob and Howard Turner. He believed he was using my knowledge for his advancement, never understanding that each translation strengthened my resolve and weakened his authority. With each Latin phrase I rendered into English, the unnatural hierarchy between us eroded. He saw only the translations. I saw the path to freedom they illuminated. The manuscript also contains a chilling account that may refer to the night of the fire, when he finally admitted no amount of knowledge would earn what was promised, when he burned the papers that would have made me legally what I already was in mind, a free man. I understood that some chains cannot be broken through bargains with those who forge them. As he raised his hand against me, I spoke the words I had found in an ancient text, words that had waited centuries to be spoken in that moment. Fiat justitia ruat caelum. Let justice be done, though the heavens fall. The manuscript ends abruptly there, leaving the author's ultimate fate unresolved. Forensic analysis revealed traces of ash embedded in the paper, suggesting these pages survived some form of fire. Whether they represent Jacob's actual account or someone else's reconstruction remains debated among historians. In 1967, a team from Tulane University conducted ground-penetrating radar surveys of the former Willow Creek plantation. Their findings included evidence of what appeared to be a tunnel leading from the library to a point beyond the formal boundaries of the estate. Professor Margaret Haynes, who led the investigation, noted, "The existence of this previously undocumented passage suggests an escape route that someone familiar with the property could have used. It's impossible to determine when it was constructed or by whom, but its presence introduces the possibility that someone could have survived the fire by means not apparent to observers at the time." Local oral histories collected by the Federal Writers Project in the 1930s include accounts from descendants of people enslaved at nearby plantations. One narrative, provided by Elijah Johnson, then in his 80s, stated, "My grandmother told me about a man they called the Reader, who knew the white folks' secret languages. She said one night there was a big fire at the Turner place, and everybody thought he died. But months later, people started talking about seeing him far away from there, teaching others what he knew. The master had promised him papers for his learning, then took back his word. My grandmother said, that fire wasn't no accident, it was judgment." Another account from Sarah Williams described how, after the war, there was an older man with bad scars who would come through sometimes, teaching people their letters. He didn't stay nowhere long, always moving like somebody might be looking for him. He spoke different than most folks, using big words and sometimes words nobody understood. My daddy said he'd been a slave who burned down his master's house when the master wouldn't let him go, but he got out somehow. Don't know if it's true, but that's what they said. These oral histories, though recorded decades after the events they describe and filtered through generations of retelling, add texture to the documented evidence. They suggest a narrative in which Jacob not only survived but continued to use his knowledge to undermine the intellectual foundations of slavery by teaching others. In 1879, a small academic journal published a review of a newly discovered translation of Seneca's letters. The reviewer noted that the translation, submitted anonymously to the publisher, demonstrated an unusual perspective on the philosopher's meditations on freedom and the natural equality of men. The manuscript was accompanied by a note stating that the translator had learned Latin under unusual circumstances that provided unique insight into Seneca's discussions of liberty. Though the translation received little attention at the time, modern scholars have noted striking similarities in style and approach to the fragments found at Willow Creek. Elizabeth Turner died in 1864 in Charleston, having never remarried. Her will, preserved in South Carolina State Archives, included an unusual provision. A sum of money was to be donated to educational endeavors among the formerly enslaved, in recognition that knowledge belongs to no master. This remarkable statement from a former plantation mistress has been interpreted by some historians as acknowledgement of her role in the events at Willow Creek and possibly as atonement. The story of Jacob and Howard Turner might have remained buried in fragmented documents and local legend had it not been for the civil rights movement of the 1960s, which prompted renewed interest in historical narratives that challenged traditional accounts of slavery. In 1968, Dr. James Washington published The Reader of Willow Creek, Intellectual Resistance Under Slavery, the first comprehensive analysis of the case. Washington argued that Jacob represented a form of resistance rarely acknowledged in historical accounts. While scholarship has documented physical resistance through rebellion and escape, the case of Jacob illustrates intellectual resistance, the refusal to accept the mental boundaries imposed by the institution of slavery. His mastery of Latin, a language associated with education, privilege, and Western intellectual tradition, constituted a profound challenge to the ideological underpinnings of slavery, which relied on the fiction of innate intellectual inequality. The discovery in 1969 of a diary kept by Reverend Samuel Whitmore added another dimension to the story. In an entry dated May 18, 1842, just weeks before the fire, he wrote, "Visited Turner Plantation today. Found the master in an agitated state. He confided that his experiment with the learned slave had taken an unexpected turn. The man now refuses to translate further texts without legal guarantee of manumission. When I suggested that such remarkable abilities might indicate divine favor and deserve reward, Turner became hostile. Would you have me admit that a black man can master what takes white scholars years to acquire?" he demanded. "What would that mean for the natural order we have established?" I left troubled, not by the slave's abilities, but by Turner's reaction to them. This entry suggests that Howard Turner recognized the broader implications of Jacob's intellectual capabilities. Acknowledging them would undermine the pseudo-scientific racism that helped justify slavery, the belief that those of African descent were inherently intellectually inferior. Jacob's Latin fluency represented not just an individual anomaly, but a direct challenge to the ideological framework of Southern society. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, archaeological work at the Willow Creek site continued intermittently. In 1984, excavations uncovered a small metal container beneath what had been the library floor. Inside were several coins, a carved wooden figurine, and a piece of parchment bearing the Latin phrase "Libertas perfundet omnia luce." "Freedom will flood all things with light," a quotation from Cicero. The container appeared to have been deliberately placed, perhaps as a time capsule or symbolic gesture. Carbon dating indicated it had been buried shortly before the fire. In 1987, a manuscript collection donated to Howard University included letters from a teacher working with freed people in Mississippi during Reconstruction. The teacher described meeting an elderly gentleman bearing severe burn scars who assisted in her classroom. "Despite his physical limitations, his mind remains extraordinary," she wrote. "He teaches Latin and Greek to advanced students and speaks of knowledge as the true path to liberation." When I asked about his scars, he said only that he had once been trapped in a house of books and emerged transformed. The locals regard him with a mixture of awe and unease, as if he carries some powerful secret. This account, dating from 1872, provides one of the last potential references to Jacob. If he indeed survived the fire and escaped, he would have been in his 50s by this time. No further reliable records of someone matching his description have been found after this date. The final piece of this historical puzzle emerged in 1968, when renovations to an old church in Baton Rouge revealed a hidden compartment in the pulpit containing a small leather-bound book. The book, its cover badly damaged by water and age, contained handwritten passages in Latin with English translations. On the inside cover was an inscription, "Property of Jacob Turner Freeman, 1843. The appearance of the surname Turner is particularly significant. If authentic, this suggests that Jacob not only survived but adopted, or was given, the name of his former owner, a common but loaded practice among freed people after emancipation. The date, 1843, less than a year after the fire, indicates that someone using this name and possessing advanced knowledge of Latin was active in Louisiana at that time. The book contains personal reflections rather than formal translations. One passage reads, "I have walked through fire to claim what was always mine. My body bears the marks of that passage, but my mind remains unburned. Some would call it miracle that I live, others would name it providence. I recognize it as justice, long delayed but finally served. The master who thought knowledge could be contained like property now knows the truth, though too late for his earthly understanding." Another entry, dated December 25, 1843, states, "On this day when others celebrate a different liberation, I mark 1 year of my own. The price was high, higher than should ever be demanded for what is natural right. Yet I cannot regret the path, only that it required such terrible illumination to light the way. I teach now what was taught to me, passing freedom through letters and words to minds still shackled by ignorance imposed upon them." Handwriting analysis conducted in 1970 confirmed similarities between these entries and the translation notes found at Willow Creek, providing compelling evidence that Jacob survived the fire. How he escaped and whether Elizabeth Turner assisted him remains speculative, though the bank withdrawal and her hasty departure suggest her possible complicity. The final entry in the leather-bound book, dated April 3, 1847, reads, "I depart tomorrow for points north. Louisiana holds too many shadows, too many eyes that might recognize what should remain hidden. I leave these words behind, buried in wood and faith, a testament that may never be read. Perhaps that is fitting. My story is but one page in a larger text of resistance through knowledge, of minds that refused to be owned even when bodies were held captive. Veritas vos liberabit. The truth shall set you free." No further confirmed records of Jacob exist after this date. He vanishes from historical documentation, leaving behind fragments of a life that challenged the fundamental assumptions of his time. Whether he lived out his days as a teacher, continued north to Canada, or met some other fate remains unknown. The story of Willow Creek and its remarkable translator has been incorporated into historical narratives of resistance under slavery, though it remains less known than accounts of rebellions or escapes. Yet in many ways, Jacob's intellectual resistance represented an equally profound challenge to the system. A demonstration that the artificial boundaries created to separate human beings based on race could not constrain the mind's capacity for knowledge. Today, the site where Willow Creek Plantation once stood bears no marker commemorating what transpired there. Industrial development has erased the physical traces of the grand house, the fields where enslaved people toiled, and the library where Latin texts became instruments in a battle for freedom. But in archives, in fragments of manuscripts, in oral histories passed down through generations, and in the leather-bound book with its final message of truth and liberation, the story remains. A haunting reminder that the most profound revolution sometimes occurs not on battlefields, but in the silent space between ancient words and their meanings. In Louisiana's St. Charles Parish, some still tell the story of the enslaved man who read in perfect Latin and brought down his master's house with knowledge rather than fire. They say that somewhere, perhaps in an unmarked grave, or perhaps in the scattered educational institutions that emerged after emancipation, lies the legacy of a man who understood that true freedom begins not with legal papers, but with the liberation of the mind from imposed limitations. And they say that on certain nights, when the air is heavy with humidity and history, you can still hear whispered Latin phrases carried on the wind, ancient words speaking timeless truths about freedom, knowledge, and the indomitable human spirit. Perhaps the most fitting epitaph for this strange and disturbing case comes not from any historian or document, but from Seneca himself, whose works Jacob reportedly translated with such skill. Quid est ergo libertas? Potestas vivendi ut velis. What then is freedom? The power to live as you wish. In the end, whether through death or escape, Jacob claimed that power, not through physical strength or violent rebellion, but through the quiet revolutionary act of reading ancient words and understanding their promise of a world where knowledge, not birth or race, determined a person's worth. In doing so, he illuminated the fundamental contradiction at the heart of a society that celebrated classical learning while denying human equality. A contradiction that would eventually consume that society in the flames of war, just as it had consumed the library at Willow Creek in the fire of 1842. As historians continue to piece together fragments of this remarkable case, the questions it raises remain relevant. Who controls knowledge? Who determines who has access to it? And what happens when those defined as intellectual inferiors demonstrate abilities that undermine the very foundations of that definition? These questions, which proved so combustible in a Louisiana plantation library more than 170 years ago, continue to smolder in classrooms, institutions, and societies around the world. The Latin Bible that sparked this tragic chain of events has never been found, but perhaps its physical presence matters less than the principle it represents, that words, ideas, and knowledge cannot be truly owned or controlled. They pass from mind to mind, igniting understanding that once awakened cannot be extinguished, not even by fire.